Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Welcome, everybody. I'll ask you to take your seats, please. Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. This session is Innovation at Risk, How Science Funding Cuts Are Impacting Progress and Research. My name is Bryn Reese. I'm the Senior Associate Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Partnerships at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'll be the moderator for today. For the recording purposes, this is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. This panel is 2 p.m. to 3:10 p.m. And the title is Innovation at Risk, How Science Funding Cuts Are Impacting Progress and Research. And before we get started, I'm going to read the CU Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. So once again, welcome to today's... Let's try this one. Is that better? Okay. I'll move over to this one. Okay, recording. Did you get the initial information? Yep. Okay. Okay. We're going to ask that all the attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and audible disruptions are not permitted. And will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room, although I do appreciate interruptions about audio. Thank you for that. So we are going to have questions, time allotted for questions. It won't be a raise your hand and ask, but if you do have a question, raise your hand and somebody will come around and give you a note card. They'll write down your question on the note card and it'll be brought up to me to present to the panelists. So please do that at your convenience. So now I'm going to frame our discussion a little bit. I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves and we will commence. So innovation at risk. This has been a unprecedented and turbulent time for the federal funding of research in the United States. And we certainly have felt this locally with significant impacts here at the University of Colorado Boulder, but to our neighbors at NCAR and NOAA as well, and across the entire country. There have been big headlines of proposed drastic cuts to federal research funding, many of which have been largely defeated in Congress. And yet there have been, let's say, under the radar impacts on research funding, how grants are being solicited and selected and awarded. To give you some context, the two largest federal agencies for funding research in the US are the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and the Department of Energy, or DOE. And they are respectively have awarded 34% and 27% less funding year to date in 2026 than they did at this time in 2024. So we will go into details of what is happening, what opportunities and challenges does this present, what can we learn from other times in history and from other areas in the world and how they run their federally funded research. So definitely a great pleasure to introduce here our panel of experts, Ling Xin, Roger Pielke, and Noah Finkelstein. I'm going to ask each of them to please give a brief, short introduction, and then we'll have each of you give your opening remarks. And we'll go in order, so Ling, please introduce yourself first.
Hi, my name is Ling Xin. I am a science journalist. I work for a newspaper called the South China Morning Post. It's a very old newspaper, headquartered in Hong Kong. It's been around for more than 100 years. And one interesting fact about our newspaper is about half of the readers are based here in the US. So I have been writing about science and science policies for about 20 years, and I mostly write about physics, astronomy, and space, as well as US-China science policies. I am based in Ohio.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Roger Pielke. I'm a local. I started my career at NCAR up on the Mesa and worked there for about 10 years, and I was recruited to come to CU, where I started a science policy center, which is in the shadow of this hotel. I drive down Grandview, and I don't know where I am. I retired from CU at the end of 2024, and I joined a think tank in DC. And I'm still in Boulder, and it is an interesting time, and I look forward to our conversation.
As do I. Thank you so much for including me. My name is Noah Finkelstein. I'm a professor in the physics department here. I'm also vice chair of the department. I also direct a center here, the Center for STEM Learning. I'm very involved in higher education policy, considering higher education a public good. And so I spend time both on the foundational research enterprise as well as on the infrastructure that it provides for our society. And I also, in addition to thanking the CWA for including us, I want to thank the students for being here. Shout out to you all. Please do ask questions. You are the ones who are inheriting some of the opportunities we've provided for you in the modern era.
Thanks very much. And Noah, thanks for that prompt on students. If you are asking a question and writing that down for one of our assistants to pass up, and you are a student, please include that you are a student on your question so that we can appropriately prioritize your question. So I'll again ask the panelists to go down the line and provide your opening remarks on our topic.
Maybe we should go with these two first, because I guess I'll mostly provide a China perspective, but our focus is on the U.S. funding. Right?
Sounds good, Ling. Noah, why don't we come back from your direction?
That sounds fun. And you will all come to understand that more important than a speaking fee is my stop speaking fee. So it's such a pleasure to be here and to talk about such an important topic here. And I'm going to go 30,000-foot view and hearken to one of yesterday's opening sessions on the role of higher education in democracy. Why do we have a society and a democracy, and what are the roles for higher education and the federal government to those ends? And I would say, in part, an answer to that is to advance the lives of individuals and advance our collective welfare. And this is done, in part, through science and, perhaps more importantly, federal funding. The investment that has been made by the federal government transforms lives, it enhances the capacities of individuals, and builds our society. It also provides safeguards for us all, from the most vulnerable of us to the most privileged, or at least that's what it can do and does in IDEAL. And while we're going to focus here on science funding, I also want to give a shout out to the humanities, to the social sciences, fields of communication, even to engineering. That these are essential in our lives here, especially now as we teeter on the age of AI and the influence of computers, robots, and a variety of technologies that are arriving into our daily lives. To that end, I like to ask the questions, what capacities must we maintain as individuals and as a collective to maintain our humanity and our society? What are those things that we choose to hold on to if we can outsource everything else? And we choose to do that if computers are going to be better at a lot of the functions that we currently engage in, and we can debate about whether or not they are or will. But my question is, what do we want to hold on to? What kind of society do we want to have? So none of these things, a democracy, a society, our scholarly and scientific enterprise, which contributes to all of these, should be taken for granted. Each requires a level of maintenance and a form of investment, reflection and critique, which I hope we can get into, and sort of honest, engaged debate, and continue with the hope of continuous improvement in our processes. This is what we engage in. And so I will double down on a scientific approach because, carpenter, hammer, nail, I'm a physicist. So I will focus on that as a lever for engaging and investing in our society. This has been instrumental to our advancement, and it's not without its own challenges. And we certainly have plenty of opportunities, but we must now double down on where we are at and the threats and opportunities that face us around that. So I'll happily go on and talk about recent developments, but we'll maybe hold off on that.
All right, I'm going to tell a story.
Tell me a story.
I'm going to tell you a story. So snuggle up. The modern scientific enterprise started in the aftermath of World War II. And it became characterized by the notion of a social contract, a much debated phrase in science and technology policy. But the basic gist of it was that in exchange for generous federal support and few strings, the scientific community, including academia, including the social sciences, the humanities, would conduct work that benefited all Americans. And that would include research, that would include education at universities. And that expanded through the space program, expanded through the 1970s. If you take a look historically at American public support for the scientific enterprise, throughout the 1970s and 80s, it was Republicans who had much greater support than Democrats. Part of that was the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the dissatisfaction that many on the left had with the military-industrial complex. There's two kind of momentous points in time where things changed. One was the end of the Cold War. The Cold War provided an overarching justification for why we invest in science and technology. We have to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall came down, so too did the widely accepted justification for why we need research. The 1990s were characterized by efforts in the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, to implement new review criterion, the broader impacts. Why are you doing the work you do? What's the justification? In the 1970s and 1960s, it was obvious. There was no need for that. Things started to change, and we started seeing a reversal amongst folks on the left and the right in support for science. Things really changed after 2000. I noticed this in my own career. After 2000, so Bush and Gore went to the Supreme Court, George Bush became president. We entered into the Iraq War based on questionable intelligence. The Bush administration was not particularly friendly to science. Funding was great at that time, but there was a lot of policies that a lot of the scientific community took issue with. Really, 2004, the Bush versus Kerry election was one where things changed. And that's one where scientific institutions like journals, National Academy, AAAS, started becoming more overtly partisan. And the Democratic Party decided that science was going to be a good wedge issue. Because increasingly Democratic voters in this country over the last 2 decades have become more educated, wealthier, more liberal, more on the coast, more in university towns. And so there was a natural partnership that emerged there. We saw the beginnings of a partisan divide in the other direction, where Democrats openly said we're the party of science, we support science, and Republicans said we can make a lot of mileage by attacking the scientific community, all those lefties in Boulder and Berkeley and so on. The story I'm going to tell here is one where there has become a partisan split between academic institutions, scientific community, and the Republican Party in this country. No one's blameless, but this deviates from that social contract I mentioned. Science exists to serve all Americans, and the pandemic really forced that open even wider. And so we now have a situation where there are many leaders in the scientific community, both public intellectuals and leaders of institutions, who are making the case that we, academics, should become more partisan. We should align on the left and oppose the right. And this is a problem in this country because guess what? There's 5 million, thereabouts, PhDs in this country, and about 65 million people with terminal high school degrees. And so if scientists in academia decide, yeah, we're going to become partisan, we're going to lose. And I'm not a fan of the Trump administration. I'll be happy to talk about, the bad things they're doing to NOAA, to NCAR, to NIH.
And to me, Noah, the other Noah.
And the other Noah. It's definitely a sledgehammer approach, and I've characterized it in writing as vengeance. But we in the academy aren't innocent victims either. Some people have become happy warriors in this situation. So I'll be happy to discuss.
So I am going to trying to provide a China perspective on the science funding. So I want to start with a number. In the year 2024, for the first time, China surpassed the United States in the total research and development spending. According to the latest report from OECD, which was released last month, after adjusting for purchasing power, China spent $1.03 trillion, while the US spent $1.01 trillion on research and development in 2024. That is a small difference, but it's not trivial because it's unprecedented. Some people called it a major shift in global innovation. If we take a step back, for many years in China now, the concept of self-reliance and building China into a scientific and technological powerhouse has been a national policy and a priority. Now, much of the R&D money has gone into what the government calls the bottleneck technologies, which are areas where China still rely on other countries, such as advanced chips. And one of the biggest advantages of a top-down government is arguably, long-term, stable, and consistent funding. And it perfectly, the space sector perfectly shows how a latecomer can actually catch up and even surpass, the leader in some aspects. For instance, in the past 30 years, China built its own navigation system with global coverage and about similar accuracy with, compared to the GPS system. China has its own space station. And China has even done some of the things that the US has not done. For instance, China has landed on the far side of the moon and brought back moon samples from there. Since all the Apollo and lunar samples are from the near side, those Chinese samples are of extremely high scientific values. And China is also on track to become the first country to retrieve samples from Mars after the US Congress effectively killed NASA's Mars sample return mission earlier this year due to cost overruns and lots of delays. When it comes to funding cuts here in the US, One of the long-term impact I'm seeing is probably the chilling effect on the research community and the exodus of top talents. I can remember how many stories we have run in the past year saying, another top Chinese American scientist has decided to leave the US for good and take up a full-time position in China or Hong Kong. We are seeing this across all disciplines, from mathematics to quantum physics to life sciences and computer science, and we're seeing this across all ages. Some of these professors came to the US in the 1990s to pursue their American dreams. Now they're back in China, built up their own, their new lab. Even younger researchers in their 40s or even 30s chose to go back to China, and they said, and I quote, they found they have lost the freedom to collaborate internationally and even to travel outside the US. So, of course, Chinese American researchers are not the only ones that are leaving this country, and China is far from the only destination. But this mass exodus of top talents, how it's going to affect the US research system and its global leadership, I think we will need time to see the full impact.
Thank you very much to each of you for those opening statements. Before we jump into some specific questions on those remarks, I'd like to hear from each of you, please, as we get into some of the details, something that you see as the most significant development in the last, let's say, 12 months that is impacting the research funding environment. And that could be in the United States, it could be a development in the United States, or it could be a development abroad. So I know there are many, many developments over the last 12 to 18 months. Please pick your one most significant.
I'll give you my one with two parts. Classic professor move. If I were a lawyer, there would be subparts to those two parts. I think the greatest concern right now is uncertainty, is probably what I would put down, or at least it's one of the gravest concerns. I will also note that our funding levels are at or near all-time high levels of investment. There's a remarkable level of investment, and many thanks to the US Congress for shoring up investments in science, and may they do again in the next budget cycle, which was recently proposed to be cut dramatically, as we know. So I think this whole question about uncertainty, will the funding exist? To what ends or for what? Why is it that we're engaged in doing it? For whom? Who's enabled to be funded, and how do we engage? Because all of those things are quite uncertain and variegated, and much of this actually is in the midst of litigation right now. And of course, funding enables action, and that's hugely important. So if the funding is insecure, that not only do we pay salaries and equipment and travel and all the rest of that, that enables the amazing work, much of which has happened in this remarkably small town. I mean, and we can talk about why we are as we are here in the greater Boulder County and the Front Range. But funding also establishes priorities for a society. What is it that we're going to invest in? China is making very clear statements about its investments as to what ends. It's also a proxy for value. And what is it that we value and engage in? There's tremendous symbolism involved in this. Who are we? And what is it that we want to become in all of this? And so similarly, lack of funding or uncertainty of funding and the types of funding are the same in that. I think that that's coupled to my second point, which is really coupled to this, which is there are overt challenges right now and debate, and in fact increasing partisan debates, and something that historically was not partisan, as Roger had noted here. And I think underpinning this, talking to individuals, questions about the nature of the world and curiosity, those are bipartisan issues. That's Science itself is highly political, but is not necessarily partisan in how we engage, or doesn't have to be. And so this doubling down on uncertainty and wedge issues are things that are threatening the vitality, not just of science itself, but a cornerstone that'll go back to the beginning of the infrastructure for our society and democracy.
All right, my one thing is going to be, I'm going to invoke Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark, and I'm going to talk about the Congress that didn't conduct oversight. As has been said, Congress has not acquiesced to the president's budget, either in the first Trump term or so forth this term. There's a game that gets played in Washington that if an administration wants to spend more money on something, the Department of Defense, $1.5 trillion, they can send to Congress a budget that cuts really popular things because they know there's not much risk. Congress will save the day. And guess what? When we spend more than we bring in, it's Congress's fault because they didn't listen to what the president said. So part of the budgetary process is a bit of theater. I was just driving over here a little while ago, and I heard Senator Dave McCormick from Pennsylvania, Republican, talking about how NIH should get a lot more money. Basic research has been always very popular across both parties for all time, one of the most popular funding areas. Dan Sarowitz, one of my colleagues, has written that if you take a look at the amount of spending as part of the domestic discretionary budget, it's been between 10 and 12% for the last 50 years. And so that's about as lock solid as you get. What Congress is not doing, they're providing money, but they're not providing oversight. So the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, is using their executive authorities, it started with DOGE, but to hamstring the federal agencies. I just talked to a federal scientist who recently retired here at this conference who said, when I was asked to sign an oath of allegiance to the Trump administration, I sent in my resignation. There are plenty of stories of difficulties. I just got a briefing last week from folks at NIH that they have lost the capacity to move money out the door. Nobody's against cancer research, but one of the things that happened is a fundamental loss of institutional capacity across the federal agencies due to the Trump administration's actions. Congress has been absent. For example, there has not been a hearing on NCAR. NCAR is a project. It's an FFRDC. It's a research project. It's a big one, but it's a research project. Politicians don't get to pick what research is funded. This goes beyond the authority of the Trump administration. Congress has not stepped up and said, all right, we're going to have a hearing on this crown jewel in the atmospheric research ecosystem of the United States. Immediately after there was the announcement about NCAR, which may or may not have something to do with Tina Peters and MAGA and all that craziness, a statement was put out in support of NCAR from some politicians, including the Colorado delegation. It was all Democrats. If you wanted to put out a statement that would inflame matters, then make NCAR a partisan issue. We all experience weather. It doesn't matter who you vote for. So Congress, they should apply their bipartisan sensibilities on the budget to oversight because the institutions matter as much or more than whatever the absolute amount of the budget is.
Thank you. Roger, a quick follow-up question on that. What has changed in recent, I think we're really talking about months here, to go from one of the very rare topics that seem to unite this country and cross the partisan divide in basic research, the translation of research into economic growth. I've always been really caught by how senators and others from both sides could speak in support and in a well-informed way on a single topic. We're not seeing that now, and that's new. What do you think happened?
Yeah, I guess, my view very much is that it's not new. It's been a slowly warming pot that's started to boil. And it turns out that, and again, no one's blameless, that about 20 years ago, Republicans and Democrats agreed we can use science and expertise as a wedge issue. We can use it in different ways, obviously. Some of you may remember the late Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma showed up on the Senate floor with a snowball and held it up, and he said, how can there be global warming if it's snowing in Washington? And it was very popular with the people that voted for him. At the time, there was a book written by a journalist named Chris Mooney called The Republican War on Science. Republicans are causing a war on science. Democrats love that, rallied around that. And so there's a deeper story here, but coupled along with that, I have a slide I show in my presentations on this that has the distribution of faculty political affiliations from 1968, the year I was born. And it turns out across, they use the term fine arts, not the humanities, but across the fine arts, social sciences, physical sciences, it was pretty balanced, almost a third, a third, a third. Over time, for whatever reason, the academy has skewed much more to the left. It's not a surprise, everyone knows that. Faculty have academic freedom. They can advocate for what they want. I'm a super strong supporter of that. But at some point, we in universities, institutions of science, decided that we were going to repurpose these institutions for advocacy gains. We were going to organize, we were going to create, and I saw it firsthand. We were going to have a project that's going to advance progress on climate change, or pick your favorite topic, in some ways replicating the NGO atmosphere. Our job at universities is to do research, to teach and perform service. And the minute that we repurposed those institutions, it became very easy for those institutions to be a flashpoint. And so there is a big movement now in universities for what's called institutional neutrality. I don't think it works. It's not possible. I've written about institutional restraint, that we should stick to our mission. But I do think that as American politics has become more polarized, we too, in the scientific community, have gone along with that. And we need to step back from that and, I hate to use the phrase, but be the adults in the room and say, hey, we serve everybody in this country, no matter who you vote for. You politicians, you can fight it out. That's not our game.
I'll just jump in a little bit and violently agree on some things and perhaps disagree on others in terms of cart and horse and what leads to this. I will say there's plenty of headroom within the academy for us to improve, but this is at root. Our institutions are part of the founding of our society, more for some within our society than others historically, but like the origin story of these United States goes back in some part, and partnership, and as you said, in the 1940s with Vannevar Bush in the modern era, but it goes way back to the investment of who we are and what we are about. In some sense, it's always been political, but I want to double down on the fact that it isn't necessarily partisan to that end, and that we within the academy, when my colleague Junya is conducting the highest precision measurement in human civilization, right here down the road, that's not a partisan issue. I would say it's probably political. He needs funding to engage in what he's about, or those people who here at NIST and then JILA created the foundations for the Global Positioning Satellite System, which the Chinese now have replicated, perhaps because of high politics in the nature of all that. That is not a partisan issue. Those are investments in the future of our society and the welfare of individuals. Why and how individual faculty members choose to operate and engage politically, especially within the sciences, that's a personal issue that's not, and being called out as a partisan divide that I think is fairly surface level division that is being fomented. There are some deep structural issues, but I also think that there's a high level of bifurcation in our society that is fomented through sound bites and tweets. And once we get together and talk about what our commonalities are, there's much more in that, especially around the scientific enterprise, that unites us than divides us.
Can I just quickly respond?
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have a quick one, and then I'm going to put a question to Link. Thank you.
You invited us.
Is that, okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to, I agree with all that, and I don't think that every academic is politicized. I'll just give you one anecdote. In 2000, the journal Nature, which is one of the two, Nature and Science, two big journals in the scientific community, endorsed Joe Biden for president. Number one, it's London-based, so what are you doing in our business? And number two, the idea that Nature is going to somehow influence the election. Now, after they did that endorsement, there was a study done by Zhang et al., and they found that that endorsement by itself polarized perceptions of the scientific community. When the 2024 election came around, Nature endorsed Kamala Harris, and they wrote an editorial, and they said, we are aware of the research that says that this polarizes the public against science. It's too important, this election. We are willing to sacrifice the politicization in order to try to have influence. And so it's not the rank and file that is the issue. It's the leadership of the most prestigious institutions in the scientific community.
So, Ling, is there a single change or development either here or abroad that you would highlight as most significant in the last year to 2 years?
Well, I don't have insider information as these two gentlemen, but I'm going to expand a little bit on the Mars sample return mission that I just mentioned. I know NASA let go hundreds of leading scientists in the past year, and they just, and the Mars sample return mission has basically been abandoned. It is really surprising at this point that China is actually going to be the first to return samples from Mars because the US has been working on Mars for decades. So many missions landed on Mars. China only made it there once. And, those tubes of samples have already been collected by the rover, NASA rover, and they're just laying on Martian surface waiting to be picked up. And because they were sampled from different locations, they are of very diverse and high scientific values, which is different from China's approach. China is going to only land in one location and try to grab samples from slightly different areas and just grab and go approach. So, I mean, it's really a shame.
And
Can the Chinese pick up our samples? And
I think all the landings China have done on the moon and Mars is on relatively flat surfaces. And your samples are collected from really complex, terrains, so I'm not sure.
well, perhaps a related question about scientific collaboration. This is from a CU student. And really, this is a two-parter. I'll start with the second first. This is for you, Ling. Do you wish the U.S. and China could collaborate more between their R&D powerhouses to expedite innovation, or do you think separation is necessary?
I mean, decoupling has been going on for at least a decade. But of course, especially in basic science, international collaboration is, used to be really the way to go. But for instance, for instance, particle physics, of course, we have this huge particle collider in Europe where American scientists, European scientists, Chinese scientists all go to experiment, right? But in space, US and China never work together, because there's a law called Wolf Amendment. It's in the appropriation bill of NASA every year. So China and the US cannot have bilateral collaboration in space unless they get special approval from Congress. So that is why some American scientists needed to get approval to apply for our moon samples. I mean, as long as that amendment is in place, there's no way China and NASA can collaborate.
So thank you, everybody, for your questions. This is great. I'm kind of drowning in opportunities here. And excuse my struggling with editing handwriting here. But this is a question I think mostly directed to you, Roger, but I think everyone can comment on this. Could you dive into whether you believe the DOGE cuts were involved in crippling the warning chain of command before the flood in Texas or any other weather events?
The first thing I'll say is if you take a look at federal government spending before and after DOGE, there's no such thing as DOGE cuts. Again, it's disruption to the operation of the federal agencies. This is a great question. And the answer is, where's Congress holding a hearing to do oversight to see what the effects are? Anyone can offer an opinion and an opine, but the performance of the federal agencies, operational agencies like the National Weather Service, is directly under Congress. And again, I'm a big fan of Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress has been absent on many issues, and this is just another one of them.
I'll answer. Yes. I'm kidding. I don't know about sort of the weather world, but certainly within the National Science Foundation, there are at least two major challenges that result from DOGE and like-minded approaches, which is to cripple the infrastructure of these organizations. So people have been let go. There are not enough staff in order to get the funding that was appropriated from Congress out the door. And coupled with that is the oversight of how money is being spent. It's being in the midst of litigation right now. It's quite possibly and likely illegal in terms of the forms that the executive branch is stepping on the authority, rarely exercised by Congress, to allocate budget in those ends. So, and also how the budget is being allocated, not to mire ourselves in the weeds. But the bottom line is there are lots of ways to stifle the pipe for funding this basic research, which is beloved by our society, especially if we call it scientific research rather than basic. There was a whole study on, do people understand what basic means? But the point here is that this provides basic infrastructure for our society to advance, and will we continue to engage in that? Congress has said yes, but things like DOGE have stifled its capacity. And same thing here. I mean, I could, if y'all want, shed a litany of concerns here about cuts here at CU Boulder that have been, foundational to our ability to support current and future welfare of individuals in our region alike.
Please expand. Please expand on those cuts at CU Boulder.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll put this in broader context. So, in the end, the bad news is tens of millions of dollars are cut from our budget. The good news, I guess, that literally have been cut. I've had a federal grant that was cut, that was removed to support graduate students who are learning the very threatening areas of physics, engineering, math, chemistry, and biology. This was a graduate fellowship program here. So while there are tens of millions, I mean, our overall federal infrastructure budget here, federal funding, is over $500 million per year. So relatively small, and yet we were among those institutions that was most cited as having problematic and having funding cuts here, especially when it came to issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was one of the signing orders from the executive on January 20th. So we had 59 awards that were terminated. 19 of them have been returned after stop work orders. But these are things that impact individuals' lives. We have a number of students, we in the physics department have been clamoring. We'll see how it shakes out, whether or not foreign nationals who are graduate students and postdocs in the physics department who are working and conducting their research at NIST, are they allowed to be on the NIST campus? And this has never been a threat to us. I think it's rooted in the '69 Espionage Act. I'm not positive to those ends. However, those forms of disruptions, which we can stave off and we can put our energy into making sure that individuals are whole and can conduct their work, that is the form of uncertainty that I find so chilling and disruptive. And if you're a foreign national student looking where to go to graduate school or conduct leading postdoctoral research, would you come to the place that discovered a new state of matter that has the highest precision measurement in human history, that's the foundation for the first quantum qubit, for quantum computing that is, the coldest spot in the universe, dare I go on, that has world-leading drone research going on. Would you come here, or would you go to a country that is pouring literally or the European Union, which is pouring hundreds of millions of dollars to recruit the talent of these foreign national students? And dare I say, and this is the story of what has, back to the earlier stages, of what is it that has made the United States a fabulous community, not without our challenges and warts and all, but we are a society of immigrants, with the exception of the Native Americans on whose ancestral lands we stand and recognize. Here, but how is it, we are all immigrants, and that is the history of the United States science enterprise, is that we have recruited and prepared people, especially post-World War II, and the advancement of that. So is that a legacy that we want to double down on, or is that a legacy that we want to stifle?
Multiple questions coming in to the effect of, is there a role, or what role is there for private support of research and philanthropic support of research in the United States? I'll place a little bit of context there. Perhaps we can comment on that and respond to that in light of, Ling, your comment earlier of advantages of long-term commitment to scientific priorities. Can private sources and philanthropic sources contribute to that? Any and all of you, please.
No. Sorry. For the record, no. Yes and no, of course. Let me get nuanced about this. And it is true that industry actually invests far more in research and development than the federal government. And sort of by my accounting, and it depends on what you count as sort of federal investment, but in 2023, the numbers were $140 billion out of the federal government, where there was $700 billion from industry. Some of which actually, dare I say, were also federal contracts, but far the minority of this. The difference, however, is what is the incentive? What are the goals, and what are we about? When industry gets involved, especially in our society, it's going to be investing in a return on investment, or for things that they believe. It's much more on the development side than the research side. And very important to have applied research and to navigate translational research. That's hugely important, and some industry does do that. But it's much less on the basic research side. And when industry invests in the basic research side, it's proprietary. It is not meant for the, at least, it's not open source, which is a push from the federal government. I will say, and so philanthropy is hugely important, but a small fraction of that, less than 10% of the over, and it's not going to take over sort of the enterprise for that, and has its own agenda in this end. So when Roger said before, the federal, the social contract to say, go do varied and interesting and foundational things, that's what the federal government is for. That's what we were engaged in doing. I will say universities are stepping up to the plate, and by latest account from the Association of American Universities, and shout out to them for, they're an elitist organization of the leading research universities around in the United States and in Canada, and we're among them. But great program from the AAU. They're tracking this, and 25% of the research funding to leading research universities is now self-funded. Universities are stepping up and providing our own funding to conduct this kind of work. You might ask who's paying for that, and we can have that discussion later. So anyway, I don't see given the scale, I don't see the replacement either from industry or from philanthropy in this way. I think there's headroom to be creative, but then the question is, to what end? How are the strings attached?
Other thoughts or opinions on that?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that was all very well said. There are roles and responsibilities. Universities, for their part, universities are hungry beasts, and universities have been looking for funding elsewhere. And there are a lot of issues that come up when industry funds university research. when NGOs or billionaires fund university research? Those are, I think, some of the more difficult questions, and why it is so important to maintain the understanding that the research that we do with that $140 million of federal funding,
Billion.
thank you, it pays off. The biggest funder of R&D in the federal government is the military. And there are big questions about military funding. When early in my career here at the University of Colorado, we were talking about developing a policy for dual-use research that could be used for military applications. What if it's top secret and you can't publish it in a peer-reviewed journal? So there are a lot of these questions, and I think the biomedical fields have gone through a lot of difficulty with conflicts of interest and disclosure related to funding of university research. And I think we have to extend that more broadly as universities seek to expand the money that they can tap into.
I'll give a shout out to the military for leading to M&Ms. Tang.
No, that was
and NASA. Skiing, the Jeep, a variety of GPS. On this. Maybe I'll ask our colleague here. I mean, so it used to be that Chinese companies were funding American research at the universities, and that became highly political and a highly partisan issue. It seems to have stopped, but I'm curious about your take on maybe why that was or the benefit of this. And I'll preamble by saying science is an international enterprise. The challenges that face us are not bound by geographical borders in this, and we are better off collectively. So let me just put this as an enterprise, but it's not uncomplicated.
I'm not really aware of this. Which companies are you talking about?
The telecom industry was funding. It was big here in the United States. It was big here in the United States where telecom funding from China was ceded to U.S. companies, and there's a whole question about espionage that was being played out within both national labs and the universities, and that put a huge chill on all international research at the universities and oversight. That seems to have been supplanted more recently.
I don't know much about that.
So I'd like to come back.
You don't have to know all things Chinese. I apologize.
I'd like to come back to the social contract that you brought up, Roger, of basic research benefiting all Americans. Have all Americans benefited from the scientific enterprise? And if not, who's been left out?
Yeah, it's great, because the first thing I'll say is the term basic research is complicated and it's challenging because for many scientists, the notion of basic research is I follow my curiosity and good things will probably happen at the end. In reality, almost all research from the federal government comes from mission agencies, which has a goal like public health, for example. The answer is that there is a perception among the public, we can talk about the reality, but a perception among the public that the answer is no. The investment in scientific research, institutions like the University of Colorado, higher education, do not benefit everybody. I can tell you, tomorrow I'm going to the Western Slope here in Colorado. For those of you who aren't from Colorado, it's on the other side of the mountains. And it is red in terms of American politics. I'm going to be speaking in Lauren Boebert's former district. I've been lucky. I'm from Colorado. I grew up here, Fort Collins. I get to the Western Slope because I do energy policy, and I talk to folks there. And what I hear from them, both elected officials at the national, state, county level, is what's wrong with those people in Boulder? Why don't they like us? Why are they against us? I'll just give you an example from my time here. The University of Colorado Boulder started an energy institute. It's been a long time ago they started, 15 years ago. It's called RACE, Renewable and Sustainable Energy. What was excluded? Fossil fuels. 85% of the world's energy production is not studied here. Colorado is a major fossil fuel producing state. Whether you like fossil fuels or don't like fossil fuels, this is the state flagship institution, and the decision to exclude major energy source that affects the communities school districts, public goods in the Western Slope, is a message that was received by those folks. And so the reality is, yes, we all benefit from science and technology. Just take public health and improving lifespans and medical care and so on. That's undeniable. But this is where policy is different than politics. Policy is, think about what are the quality of the articles published in Nature, right? They're great quality, they advance our understanding. Politics is, why did Nature endorse a presidential candidate? And if we're engaging with the public, guess which one of those two becomes more important? It's the politics. And so the perception is, in my understanding and going around the country, despite the obvious benefits to many of us of science and technology, there's a perception that the institutions have left them behind.
I'll just piggyback on that. I think it's undeniable that science and technology and engineering has improved lives. In aggregate, no question about it either that it's differential for different populations. And you could take measures of health and well-being, that's sort of my bailiwick, but you could take financial indicators and the aggregation of wealth by those people who are engaged in that. And we are, and a bunch of the technology world has, the advent of federally funded internet, no matter what, and subsequently web, started by physicists at CERN, there with support from Al Gore, just not invented, in that advance everybody's lives. In fact, that's where people are sitting now in their echo chambers and communicating on sound bites and tweets around that. So what is the antidote to that? I think the answer is, as Roger said, communication, meeting people where they're at. I think that this is something now, whether we like it or not, we all have a role to play in arguing for why, when, and how science can advance our lives, to be a little bit humble about this, to know when it can't, where the bounds of it are. This is also why I would argue, and a shout out for the humanities and liberal arts more broadly, so that we know maybe questions of ethics and why and when and who engage in all of these enterprises, but also how we communicate about science. And this is something that we scientists have been suffered a little bit of hubris in the past, that it was taken as a de facto good, and we are now learning about our essential roles in communicating the value and purpose of the work that we do. And I think that's a powerful thing. This is where the community is coming together, and there's a science communication panel at the event, I think tomorrow, in this, so come see that or visit a table outside about science communication that's going on. I think that this is an endeavor that we all need to be engaged in, and rather than suffer these partisan divides or just divides that we have, and it doesn't have to be donkeys and elephants or whatever animal supports the independence, I'm not sure. We meet people where they're at, talk to them, and bottom line is, it's not always the case, but often that people will find, especially around matters of science, technology, and the advancements that we have, that there's more that we support. We just have to share our stories and speak in ways that people can hear.
Let me just say one thing on that, on the divides. I've told a story of a partisan divide related to perceptions of science and technology. That's not the only divide. The education divide is even bigger. So people with terminal high school degrees versus college graduates and PhDs. There's a big divide between black Americans and white Americans, between Hispanic Americans and white Americans, people who live on the coast and people who live in the Midwest. There are divides all over the place. And one of the things that we have to do a better job of is not just communicating, but actually making sure that when people look at science and technology, wherever they're from, whatever their demographics, they see themselves. And we haven't done a very good job of that.
So I asked a colleague a practice question this morning. If you were a top mind in your scientific field from another country, what would make you come to the US as opposed to another country right now? And they just said nothing. So I said, well, that's not a good question for me to ask then. That's kind of a short answer. So I'm going to shift it a bit and say, what can we learn from other countries who have prioritized science? where science is less of a divisive topic, whether that is the countries that are in Europe that are currently recruiting many top US minds, or elsewhere, China, Canada, Australia.
I will say some of the dynamics that I've explained about the United States are certainly more extreme in the United States, but there's good research that's been done by Thomas Piketty and colleagues looking at Northern Europe, and the same sort of divides between, let's say, the highly educated and wealthy versus working class, for lack of a better term, are present there also. And we see populist movements in many countries. That is a growing problem. I don't think anybody has it exactly right. I think the nature of our politics in this country has made things a bit more extreme, and the whole Trump phenomena, unless you're in Hungary or someplace, is fairly unique. So I'm not sure there's a model out there that we can say, all right, let's import this to the United States, both because I don't think anybody else has it right, but I don't think there's any political culture that's quite like ours.
I reject your question. Not exactly. It's a great question and a wonderful framing. But let me just underscore, this is a magical place to be, in an amazing time to be doing science and to be living. And the infrastructure that we have is unbelievably outstanding. I listed a number of research enterprises that are currently going on right now. We happen to be an epicenter of the world in quantum science and engineering, right here in the Boulder area. It's not the only place, but it's one of the epicenters. The reason for that, I will say, is because of investments starting back in the 1960s, or if you want to draw a stronger line, all the way back to the 1980s, right? But we can draw a direct line of investment made in the 1980s and hires here at the university as to why Inflection just, had an IPO for $1.4 billion or something like that.
1.8.
What?
1.8.
What's $400 million between friends? But the point is, and that's one. We were designated as a national tech hub in quantum science, and I'm not all quantum all the time. It's important and it's a huge thing. But I want to celebrate the fact that this is an amazing, and we can't hire people fast enough, especially educated folks with PhDs. And graduate level master's degrees and whatnot. We are in the midst of capitalizing the industry so that it is more inclusive for everybody and creating educational programs to those ends. But I want to celebrate the fact, the capacities that we have here and now. I don't want to be ignorant or stick my head in the sand and say things are not without challenge, but this is an amazing time and an amazing place to be doing the work that we're engaged in. I know people are suffering. And we are doing everything that we can, and maybe we nudge Congress a little bit harder is one of Roger's points on this. But I don't want to undersell the fact that amazing things are happening here right now. And it's ours to lose. And I'm not saying a race between us and China, although some people would frame it that way. And it's happening, especially around the world of AI. That's the way it's being framed. But it's ours to lose in terms of our investing in the future welfare, the future that our students will be inheriting. And it's a choice that we're making relatively now.
Audience question: what role does social media play, if any, on garnering support for scientific findings? Is our only path to elect science-friendly politicians? Or what solutions can we, the people, work towards to help funding come back to our institutions?
Social media, it's had the promise of democratizing everything. Everybody's going to be able to talk to each other. There was a movement in the scientific community that, coupled with social media, I think maybe made things worse. Noah's mentioned the rise of this area called science communication. And it was about 20 years ago. There was this sense, and it was accompanied by this idea that we have to show that we're having impact and that we matter. And when we told young scientists, postdocs, go out in the world, sing your song, tell everybody what you do and why it's important. And this, at the same time, the social media kind of sprung up. But what we didn't do with those young scientists is teach them about policy and politics and what it means to go out in the world. And if as many people did, that you go out and you express your values. You say what we should do on this topic, on that topic, why science is important, who the anti-science folks are. You could very distinctly get the impression, but boy, this is a hotbed of a lot of politicized folks. There's a recent study that came out that PhDs are more political on Twitter, on X, than other folks. And so with the ability to communicate to everybody all the time also comes a responsibility to understand what your role as an expert is in a democracy. And if every expert goes out and sings their song, it's like if we told folks in the music school, go out and play your instrument. Well, you're going to get a bunch of noise. You're not going to get a symphony. And so I think it's really important, and I feel bad because you can't just be a physicist and know physics. If you're going to go out in the world like Noah does, you have to understand policy and politics. It's an additional expectation that we have of experts. Being an expert in our society is a special authoritative role. You're not just a normal citizen. You get one vote like everybody else does, but you also have a big megaphone. So I think social media has been a kind of a double-edged sword.
Staying on this thread of communication, but shifting away from social media, Ling, you're in the business of communicating science. I'm sure your readership includes many who are experts in science, but many who are not. How do we bridge that divide and avoid the use of jargon and make science appealing to a broad audience?
Yeah, that would involve the ability to explain really complex concepts in simple and compelling language, and use a lot of analogs, and how to relate science, like really complicate things to our daily life. We learn this every day. I used to work for the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So back then, my reader was more like the scientific community. And now that I work for the South China Morning Post, which is a general newsroom, I realize how important it is to make science accessible to the general audience. Otherwise, just to help promote science itself.
Well, I might piggyback on those last two. I think that's absolutely right. One is we want to make science accessible to all. And, shout out to the programs that go out and reach youth where they're at. And this isn't necessarily to make more scientists or recruit folks into science, perhaps more accurately, but to make people more scientifically aware, to make people more science-philic versus science-phobic in that enterprise, so that people have a stronger sense of attachment to recognize the value. So you don't have to be a scientist. That's like, come be a physicist. It's a great life and a great career, no question about it. But maybe you're interested in something else. Maybe you're interested in policy or writing, journalism, management, however. But everybody should feel themselves as science capable, and that is a message that we have not communicated well enough, and we haven't prepared people to engage in this. To that end, it doesn't happen through sound bites. It doesn't happen through tweets in that way. So yes, it's a double-edged sword. It's just that one edge of that sword is really blunt and the other is really sharp. I'll leave you to figure out which, I think. And so I think in meeting people where they're at, that's a human feature. That's a form of human connection. So I think that's bottom line. And I know that sounds awful, but all politics is local. So let's go out and reach the people. And we have plenty of folks here who would benefit from this, as well as Western Slope. And so to engage in conversation. The last thing I'll say is my latest shtick on all of this is cultivate a sense of belonging. That is, you belong to the scientific enterprise. You don't have to do science, but that makes people feel connected, heard, understood. You belong at the university. You don't have to get a degree here, but you are welcomed here and on your terms and how to participate. It's not accidental that those people who are more educated, say, about climate change, are more and more educated as just fundamental mechanism. If you understand the mechanism of climate change, you are more likely to believe that climate change is happening. This is Mike Rainey's work from back in the day. I don't know if people are now debating whether or not it's happening, but what to do about it. So the point is providing education for folks in formal, informal ways, cultivating a sense that they belong, that they participate and they're agents in this. That is a huge step forward, frankly, for our democracy, but certainly for science.
So a great audience question. How and how long do we recover? I think, Noah, you've just led us into that, including a sense of belonging and meeting people where they're at. But other thoughts on taking this as an opportunity for development of American science as opposed to at the beginning of a dismantling?
It's a great question, and it's difficult to answer because we in the scientific and the academic community, we can control what we can control. And we definitely, as Noah said, there are some improvements we can make in universities in our practices of science. But how do we repair the larger political culture that we are a part of? I agree with Noah. It's a fantastic place to do science, and these are, it's the best of times, the worst of times. But until we can come together as a country, and again, go back to Congress where we're supposed to hash all these things out, it's going to be challenging for the scientific community because we are not in the driver's seat. We are part of society. We are responsive to politics. And if we can do our part to help bring things together, at least within our own communities, that's a step in the right direction. But it's taken us a good couple decades to collectively to get to where we are today. It's going to take a little while to get back out.
So final comment will go to you, Ling. Same question. Is there something that you think needs to happen here or that we can learn from elsewhere in order to recover the U.S. scientific enterprise?
Well, personally, I think the advantage of the American society is its openness and creativity. You are an open and free society, and nothing is more important than that when it comes to innovation. So,
That was a yes.
oh. So I personally, I think the U.S. is still going to be a global leader in innovation in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for a very lively and energizing discussion. Thank you all for coming so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ling. That was great. Yeah, thank you for your comments.